Welcome to The Map is Not the Territory, a new exhibition at Museo Na Bolom in San Cristóbal de las Casas. I'm Tim, the curator of the exhibition, and I'm going to show you around the 11 sections of the exhibition. So, we start off here in section 1, Imagine Territory. So, the title of the exhibition, The Map is Not the Territory, is a phrase from the Polish philosopher Alfred Kołobrzejski, and it basically means that what we often take for reality is only a model of reality, and maps are the perfect example of this. In reality, maps don't show the reality of a space. They only show a model, so they're subjective, they're imagined territories, hence the first section. So the perfect example of this is the Mercator projection, which everyone is accustomed to seeing, right? This is the hegemonic cartography of the world, but actually it's a distortion. The northern hemisphere is greatly inflated. You can see in reality how the actual land masses look. This is the Peters projection, which gives a much more accurate illustration of the globe. And my point of these imagined territories is that they have an effect, right? They, in the case of the Mercator's projection, it's a Eurocentric vision of the world. It inflates the importance of Europe and North America, so this has real world effects. Now, we have counter cartographies where critical geographers and other people try to draw attention to the falseness of these imagined territories. So, one of my principal aims of this exhibition is for people to think more critically about cartography and about their surroundings. So, they need to read maps like you would read any other text. You need to read it critically and ask yourself the following questions. So, what do maps include or exclude? What are the intentions of the cartographer? How could the map be used? How are places named? How is space represented? And does the map want you to think in a certain way? These are all critical questions that I want people to think about when they see the maps of the exhibition. Now, the exhibition was thought out, it's been planned for a long time to put on display some of the maps that we have in our collection. Na Bolom has almost 1,000 maps stored in the Fototeca in the garden. And I chose 50 physical maps from the collection and a further 40 maps taken from books and online to tell the story of the region known as La Selva Lacandona. But La Selva Lacandona has gone through an evolution over the past 500 years. There's been many different imagined territories about the space. Now this exhibition attempts to show the people and the objects that were critical in shaping the imagined territory as we know it today. As well as these 90 maps throughout the exhibition, there's 11 of these articles, well, these newspapers that contain 66 different articles from the archives of Na Bolom, which also tell the story of the development of the territory. Welcome to section 2, the colonial territory. Now, the 11 sections of the exhibition follow a more or less chronological order. So we kind of start our journey of the first imagined territory of eastern Chiapas in the 16th century. Now, I refer to the territory as Eastern Chiapas because, like I said, there was an evolution in the names of the territory. So it's a more neutral term because, as you will see as we go through, there were many different names. Now, the oldest map that we have in the exhibition is from 1900, and here you can see Eastern Chiapas referred to as El Desierto de la Soledad, the desert or the wilderness of solitude. Now, this brings to mind an empty place. The imaginary of Eastern Chiapas is empty, right? but this was an artificial creation. At the time of the Spanish invasion, hundreds of years prior to this map's creation, Eastern Chiapas was not an empty place. It was a peopled place. And in fact, the Spanish created the first imaginary of the space as the land of war, la tierra de guerra, because of the inhabitants' hostility to Spanish attempts of colonization. So the Lacandon Chol, who are not related to the contemporary Lacandon, lived in several different communities throughout eastern Chiapas. Now, when the Spanish first went in the 16th century, they were successful in convincing some of the Lacandon Chol to move out of the rainforest and form new colonial towns on the fringe of the jungle where they could be more easily controlled. So these colonial towns were called reductions, and we have a map showing the new colonial towns inside the chapel. So Tila, Tumbola, Yahalon, Chilon, or Cosingo are some examples. Now, during this time, the most resistant group of Lacandon Chol were living on an island in Lago Miramar called Lacantun, and here we have a map made by Franz Blom. On one particularly brutal attempt by the Spanish to conquer the Lacandon Chol of Lacantun, they were greatly reduced by the scorched earth campaign of the Spanish, and they decided to retreat deeper into the jungle, and they formed their last capital, Sac Balam. Now, at the turn of the 18th century, in 1696, 1697, the Spanish finally conquered the last capital of the Lacandon Chol. They renamed it Nuestra Señora de los Dolores de Lacandon. And several decades later, in 1714, these Lacandon Chol were sent to Guatemala, where they eventually assimilated with local indigenous populations there, and they ceased to exist as a people. So around the same time as the Lacandon Chol were forcibly evicted from eastern Chiapas, the contemporary Lacandon, who were Yucateco speaking, not Choles, moved in from Petén in Guatemala and Campeche in Mexico. And they were first sighted around Ocosingo. Now, during the colonial period, any indigenous person hostile to Spanish modernization attempts were called Lacandon. The term Lacandon referred to any indigenous person found in eastern Chiapas. And these people were seen to be closer to nature. At the same time, we have in Enlightenment thinking this division between nature and civilization. And the primitive, savage Lacandon of eastern Chiapas were firmly situated closer to nature in this modern savage binary. So section 3 is known as global desires. So following on from the colonial period, eastern Chiapas was left relatively undisturbed for hundreds of years. There were never more than around 1,000 Lacandon living there, and the territory was seen as a very hostile space, and for that reason it was ignored. However, by the 19th century, it started to be valued for its resources, right? So despite being a dangerous, hostile place to outsiders, there started to be movements into eastern Chiapas to extract resources. So here we can see in these two maps the movement of resources out of eastern Chiapas and in other parts of the state. And we've got these two cabinets with different objects. So on the right-hand side, we have a list of products of eastern Chiapas, which in the Diary of Franz was referred to as Zendala's forest, right? So these were the objects which were desired by consumers thousands of miles away, and who would, risk sending people in to extract. So we have oil, tobacco, mahogany, vanilla, copal, chicle, crocodile skin, cacao, and archaeological artifacts. So the movement of objects outside was much greater than the objects which would come into Eastern Chiapas for trade with the Lacandon. So here we have salt, panela, mirrors, and fabrics. And out of all these different objects, the two products which would really change the face of Eastern Chiapas were first mahogany and then chicle, which is chewing gum. And there were two booms in these products, and we're going to follow on now to the next two sections center on the extraction of these products. So section 4 is known as green gold mahogany hell. So European demand for mahogany in the 19th century was enormous because of its special qualities. It was a very hard, precious wood, very shiny with a nice scent. So in the 1870s, merchants from Tabasco on the Gulf of Mexico realized that there was a lot of money to be made in the undisturbed jungles of Eastern Chiapas, right? So we see the Eastern Chiapas broken up into different logging concessions. And here we have a map of one of the businesses, one of the logging companies from 1900. Now, a lot of these companies had German, Italian, foreign names. That's where the money, the wealth was to invest. And these logging concessions were located along the rivers only because it was too expensive to drag the mahogany too far across the land to the rivers. At this time, the rivers were the nodal points of transport and communication within Eastern Chiapas. And here we have two beautiful maps of the rivers which followed the route of the mahogany as it was floated downstream towards the Gulf of Mexico, where it was lifted up into ships to be sent to London, Liverpool, Hamburg, and New York. These were the main destinations of the mahogany. And here we have a quote from France talking about how the rivers really were highways of wood. It's hard to imagine now, but there were constant streams of wood flowing down the rivers. River traffic had to be halted. They were very destructive. If anything was left in the river, it would just be destroyed by these walls of wood. So we continue on into the library. We have another map of the logging concessions showing the quite complex system of the economy of the mahogany trade. So there were specialized roles, each person dedicated to one step in the process of exporting the mahogany. Now, the logging camps were horrible places, hence the name green gold, huge profits, but mahogany hell, right? So the Monterias, the mahogany camps, were often named ironically, they were called Progress, Desire, Victory, Destiny, Paradise, but they were anything but, right? There were horrible punishments for the madereros, the loggers who failed to fulfill their quota. And you would have what were known as enganchadores, men who would ply indigenous men in the highlands of Chiapas with alcohol to trick them into debt servitude, right? They would loan them money to buy alcohol, and then these loggers would have to, these men would then have to go into Eastern Chiapas to pay off their debt, and in reality, they would never be able to. They would go into Eastern Chiapas, and they would never come out. And here we show a documentary, a film, La Rebelión de los Colgados, The Rebellion of the Hanged, which was adapted from a book by B. Traven, one of his jungle novels, which tells of the brutality of the mahogany trade and the punishments Now we move on to section 5, white gold. Now, the mahogany boom ended as a result of the First World War. It disrupted movement of capital, and although the mahogany trade continued, it never reached its former glories, right at the turn of the 19th century. However, a couple of decades later, another war, the Second World War, would lead to a new boom in chicle, chewing gum. So this is because American soldiers all carried rations of chewing gum. And the quality of the chicle in eastern Chiapas was low compared to other areas like in Petén, in Guatemala, and in Belize. However, there was such a high demand in the Second World War that it became worth it, you know, to go into eastern Chiapas to extract the chicle. So, starting in around 1943, thousands of chicleros streamed into the jungle. Now, the loggers were from the highlands of Chiapas. However, the chicleros were from the Yucatan. Now, after the Mexican Revolution, the living conditions in eastern Chiapas were greatly improved from, you know, the punishments which I showed you in the previous section. But still, it was a difficult life for a chiclero. Here we have a piece of chicle, and you can see the machete of Franz, and one of his diaries from 1944 showing how chicle was produced. And this, the production hasn't changed at all from pre-Hispanic times to present day. The technique is the same, slashing a tree and collecting the chicle gum below. So whilst rivers were the node of transport in eastern Chiapas during the mahogany boom, in the chicle boom, mules and aeroplanes were more important. So there were mule trails cut through the jungle, connecting the air bases to the different chicle trees. So important were the mules that, as a means of communication, that throughout the night, the mules would carry the chicle out to the airfields, and letters and other medical supplies and food into the chicle camps. So we have this drawing by Franz showing how, with a hat, candles were placed within a hat and placed on the mule's head. So it was a constant stream. Imagine that, lights traveling through the rainforest, across rivers, constantly. So a whole series of airfields were built across eastern Chiapas. And the export of chicle was very efficient. Franz talks about this in his diaries. There would be 5 landings of a plane every day, and within, 20 minutes or so, they could unload and reload the plane. Now, the chicleros worked in small groups with a foreman and also a female cook. Now, the female cook could often return back to Tenosique or elsewhere with more chicle than the chicleros themselves. This is because she would trade her body for chicle. And something very interesting, Franz mentions in his written diaries that often the chicleros would bring their boyfriends with them, supposedly also chicleros, but their boyfriends. Now, after the chicleros returned from the jungle, they would have earned quite a lot of money, you know, and they would spend this money in the town of Tenosique, which was described by Trudy as a kind of Hollywood Wild West. And here we have some photos showing the chicleros up in the trees, and a description by Franz, you know, how you could always recognize a chiclero by, you know, his machete would always be around his waist, and he would have his ragged clothes, and he'd often be actually covered in the kind of the pink goo of the chicle. Section 6 is called Archaeology with an Agenda. Now, around the same time that the loggers and the chicleros were in eastern Chiapas, another prominent group of people but also there exploring. That's archaeologists. They were very important in shaping Eastern Chiapas, not least because they were the main map makers of the region. And they were crucial, I mean, especially France, because of the lack of decent official government maps at the time. So here we have a quote from Franz about how bad the official maps were. They showed things which weren't there. Here in this mappy, Franz writes, "Error, fantasy, this lake does not exist," right? So Eastern Chiapas wasn't very well mapped. So although it's not really recognized so much today, archaeologists were very closely tied to the economic exploitation of the territory. They were monteadores, which is somebody which goes into Eastern Chiapas, goes into the jungle for something. So Franz recognized this in himself. He recognized that he was an archaeologist, but he was no different from the chiquileros who were going in for chicle, from the madureros who were going in for mahogany, or other people going in for cacao, for vanilla. They were the same. So Franz's journey in Eastern Chiapas was tied to economic exploitation of the territory from the get-go, right? He first came to Mexico as an oil prospector. That's where he learned his cartography skills. And although we often think of him and Trudy as environmentalists, in the 1940s, they had a different perspective. Together they wrote an article in the 40s listing the different ways that Eastern Chiapas could be exploited, its different resources, hydroelectricity. And in this map that Franz made around that time, he highlights sulfur deposits and oil, and sulfur was an indication of oil. So as well as listing, archaeological sites and rivers and different things like that, resources were key as well. And the map itself was paid for by the Mexican Ministry of Defense. So archaeology has always had this connection to economic exploitation from the very beginning. Now, Mesoamerican archaeology really took off with the writings of John Lloyd Stevens, who traveled across Mexico in the 1840s. Now, it's little known that at the same time that he was writing his books, Tales of Travels Through the Yucatan, which was also illustrated by the English artist, Frederick Catherwood. You can see one of his prints here. John Lloyd Stevens was also the vice president of the Pan American Railroad Company. So as well as doing archaeological surveys, he also was surveying across Central America to find ways to better exploit it. Moving forward to Sylvanus Morley, who was a mentor of Franz. So he was surveying the Yucatan and the coast of Central America in the early 20th century, but he was also a spy for the American government looking for German U-boats. And then fast forward to 2008, there was a scandal in Oaxaca with a project of a participatory mapping project with a bunch of American geographers, Mexico Indígena. They were working with indigenous communities to collaboratively map area of the Sierra Madre Mountains, but they didn't tell their indigenous co-participants, right, that they were actually being paid by the American military. So this relation is always there. Archaeology has always had an agenda, and notably we have the most famous discovery in the Mayan world, the murals of Bonampak. This was paid for by the United Fruit Company. So on the 1943 expedition, that Franz embarked on with Trudy. This is when he first met Trudy. This expedition was paid for by the American government, and Franz was counting rubber trees in eastern Chiapas. And here's a photo of Franz and Trudy and the curator on this expedition. Section 8 is called differentiated mobility. So in the previous section I talked about the improvement of the different communication networks. Now this increased the mobility of goods and people, but it's really important to emphasize that mobility was differentiated. So there were those who had power over the forces of time-space compression, and those who were simply participants in the process. So we start here with privileged mobility. Here we have two maps showing the different touristic sites in Mexico and in Chiapas. But this was a very small elite group of people, you know, who had the money to travel to San Cristóbal in this time, in the 1950s, after the Pan American Highway was constructed. Between 1950 and 1957, 9,000 tourists visited Na Bolom. Many of them were very famous intellectuals, writers, celebrities, but very few people could afford to do this. Here we have two collages showing a lot of these different visitors from the time period, their arrival in planes, and also the trips they would go on with Franz and Trudy in the towns around San Cristóbal on mules. And within the exhibition, we took 200 photos from the archive to compile into these different collages. Now, the most privileged tourists of all were those who would accompany Franz and Trudy on expeditions into eastern Chiapas. Many of these were living out their Indiana Jones fantasies, right? This is when Eastern Chiapas was imagined as a space of adventure, no? And at the time, Franz and Trudy were also accused of exploiting the tourists for overcharging them. Here we have a collage of some of these different expeditions. Now, Barbara Sykes was a frequent visitor to Na Bolom in the 1950s. She was an intrepid South African journalist, and she gives a very interesting perspective on a female explorer in this time and some of the difficulties she faced with the men that she traveled with. And here we have a quote from Trudy about emphasizing that, you know, a woman could be an explorer, that she was just as strong as any man. Despite being 52 years old, she could, you know, walk all day in the heat and through the jungle. Barbara Sykes wrote an article about her jungle adventure, which is in one of the newspapers here, Adventure in a Mexican Jungle. And we have some of the beautiful 1950s illustrations. Okay, now we're crossing over to the other side of the patio in Na Bolom to talk about the people on the other side of the power hierarchy when it comes to mobility. So I've talked about those with privileged mobility, but now I want to talk about the people who are the victims of time-space compression, who had less power over their own mobility. So most notably, we have the loggers, right, who I mentioned earlier on entered Eastern Chiapas and couldn't leave. They were effectively enslaved. And here we have some chains brought back from Franz, from the jungle, and also a drawing he made in his diary from one of these notorious logging camps. So while people like Franz could easily move in and out of Eastern Chiapas, the loggers were trapped there. Another notable population of people who had little control over their circumstances, but who changed the geography of Eastern Chiapas, were Guatemalan refugees in the 1980s. They contributed to the opening up of Eastern Chiapas, but they had little power over the forces which forced them into this situation. So we have a map of the settlements that they formed across the border with Guatemala. So there's different types of mobilities. Right here I talk about dangerous mobility. So as the communication networks into eastern Chiapas increased, there were consequences for the Lacandon inhabitants there, right? So this increased communication networks made it easier for diseases to travel along these new routes into the jungle. So section 7 is called A Shrinking World. Now, this refers to how Chiapas became a smaller place in the mid-20th century. Now, this was primarily because of the construction of the Pan-American Highway, which was completed in 1948 and extended to San Cristóbal in 1950. It actually ended at San Cristóbal because the Guatemalan side of the Pan-American Highway wasn't constructed until later. So San Cristóbal was literally at the end of the road at this time. Also in the mid-20th century, we have an improvement in the telecommunications networks, and here we have a map showing how this network was expanded. We have a telegram. Also, there was great improvements in air transport, and we have two photographs here taken out of an aeroplane. And these allowed, this improvement in air transport allowed much more accurate maps to be made. You can see there's comments written by Fran showing the different lakes and different rivers. Now, although the communication network improved, there were always frictions to this, right? So, as I mentioned earlier, with the Chicle boom, there were 5 landings a day in each of the airstrips, but when a strong north wind blew, air transport came to a halt. And Trudy actually talks about this, how one time she became a jungle midwife for a heavily pregnant woman who couldn't get out to deliver her baby in a hospital. So this is where I introduced the concept of time-space compression, right? So Chiapas was a big space. Eastern Chiapas was a big space when you had to travel by mule. It took a long time, right? When we have the construction of airfields, it became much smaller, it became much easier to get around. But as well as improving, this could also regress. So the improvements happened primarily because of commodity extraction, right? The improvement in communications happened because of the boom in Chicle, the boom in mahogany. The boom in mahogany, river transport increased. They even blew up sections of the river so that the logs could more easily travel downstream. So we have this comment on this map here talking about how one of the companies blew up a section of the river, and you have all the mule trails being carved through the rainforest. So improvement increased and improved. However, with the collapse of the booms, it regressed again. And Franz and Trudy talk about how in their 1948 expedition, compared to their 1943 expedition, it was much more difficult to get around the jungle. So we had time-space compression, that's the shrinking of space, and then with the collapse of the booms, we have time-space expansion. It becomes more difficult to get around again. Here we have some more maps of the Pan-American Highway. And something important to emphasize is that even when there was improved communication networks, not everyone had equal access, for example, to cars. Mules continue to be very important despite the construction of the Pan-American Highway. Here we have a map of mule trails around San Cristóbal. And famously in 1956, the bridge connecting Tuxtla with San Cristóbal collapsed, and the communication network came to a halt for a couple of months. People had to take their cars across these little boats across the river. So, although it increased, we've got to remember that it was not a straightforward process. So here we have two contrasting photos. we have Trudy not holding anything and her two indigenous porters holding everything, right? And then we have a photo of a roadblock in the 21st century. So what's interesting here is that Chiapas today is better connected than ever. And in the past, when this photo was taken, indigenous people often lack control over the forces of time-space compression. However, in the 21st century, they're able to exploit our dependence on road connections to resist capitalist exploitation through roadblocks. So, in the 1940s, the improved communication networks put the Lacandon into contact with the Chicleros. They worked with the Chicleros often because the Lacandon knew where the best chicle trees were. Sometimes friendships were formed, but more often than not, there were hostile relations between the two groups. This is because of the behavior of the Chicleros, who would often steal from the Lacandon or even rape the women. Now, there's a particularly sad story about Boar, who was a Lacandon friend of Franz and Trudy. Now, in the 1950s, a crocodile hunter shot and killed his wife and children in the jungle while Boar was out with his two sons tending to his milpa. So Boar was absolutely devastated by this and had lost the will to live. Now Trudy took him and his two children, Kayum and Kin, into Na Bolom, where they were almost kind of adopted by Franz and Trudy. So here's Boar with Kin in the patio of Na Bolom. So here I talk about restricted mobilities. So interestingly, the Lacandon had always used their mobility to escape dangers. From the earliest contacts with the state and with Mexicans and the Spanish, right? So they lived in caribales, which are family groups, small family groups, and they lived a semi-nomadic lifestyle, so they could quickly leave if danger presented itself. And this was especially an issue of disease. If someone caught a cold or they saw someone sneezing, they could retreat quickly into the jungle. However, by the 1950s, the world was closing in on them. This was no longer possible. They could no longer rely on their mobility to escape the dangers. And this because they'd also become dependent on trade with Chicleros and others. Despite some of the dangers that this presented, they relied on them for guns, for machetes, for other materials. And following their expedition in 1943, 1944, Franz and Trudy wrote a report to the governor of Chiapas recommending that the Lacandon be concentrated into one single settlement so that they could be better protected and better supplied. Franz was highly critical of the impact of the Chicleros and other Monteadores on the Lacandon. He called them the scum of the jungle. However, as I mentioned in previous sections, Franz was connected to the Chicleros. He was only able to travel across eastern Chiapas because of the routes that the Chicleros made. Section 9 is called the Savage Lacandon. So back in section 2, I mentioned how the Lacandon were amalgamated with the territory. They were seen to be part of nature. So when the territory of eastern Chiapas was imagined as dangerous and threatening, naturally the Lacandon were also imagined in the same way. They were seen to be hostile and dangerous. They were part of nature as opposed to civilization. So in this newspaper here, there's articles taken from the 1940s and the 1950s, and you can see how the Lacandon were understood by the general public as primitive Stone Age people. In 1938, a group of Lacandon were transported to Guatemala and put on display at a fair there in the city, and one of the Lacandon of the group did not make it back alive. The Lacandon was seen to be, slightly above animals. There's a quote here by a tourist in 1952 who described them as such. You know, one of the reasons why they were seen to be so primitive is because they didn't live in permanent settlements. Here we have a map showing different arrows of the different Lacandon settlements. You know, this perplexed map makers because the Lacandon would never stay in one place for long. Something which often comes up in the public presentation of the Lacandon is that they're doomed to extinction. All these articles talk about how they're dying, you know, they've got very little time left. Now, the Lacandon, as I mentioned in the previous section, were greatly affected by diseases which came in. Their population did collapse as a result of contact with the modern world. However, there was more to this than simply this population decline. It was seen to be an inevitability that the Lacandon would die, because, as I mentioned, there's this binary between civilization and nature, and because the Lacandon refused to modernize, the only other option was seen for them to die out. And you see this binary of the Lacandon most clearly in these two photographs taken from the visitor books in the archives of Na Bolom. Higher up on the left, you've got the Lacandon kind of labeled in this kind of animalistic kind of way. It's kind of, you know, specimens in the, you know, primitive state. Down below, you've got the dressed up in Ladino clothes, and most clearly here you can see this binary between, on the one hand, nature, the Lacandon in that natural state, and here kind of for show, kind of for fun, you know, dressed up as civilized Lacandon. Another reason why they were seen to be primitive is because of their polygamous practices. And here in this illustration you can see how they were seen as relics of the Stone Age. So section 10 is called From Exploitation to Protection. So this section speaks to the transition in the imaginaries of Eastern Chiapas. So from a space to be exploited, this is represented by the logging concessions. You know, back to section 4, when Eastern Chiapas was broken up into geometric land holdings along the rivers. Jump to the 1970s, and still the jungle is broken up into different sections. But instead of breaking them down to exploit them, it's to protect them instead. So what does this represent? These two different images. It represents how a transformation in understandings of the rainforest from a corrupting place to be exploited, a threatening space, to a diverse, rich place to be protected. So a threatening space to a threatened space. So, but first, why was it understood as a threatening space? Well, there's various different reasons. One of them was its resistance to attempts of modernization. So most notably, attempts to bring in machines to cut down the mahogany and the cedar. These attempts failed because of the physical geography of Eastern Chiapas, because of the mud. For example, in a conventional kind of space, the more that you would walk down a trail, the easier it would be to walk down that trail in the future because of the path created by people's feet. In the jungle, these conventions, these normal conventions, didn't apply. The more people passed down a trail, the deeper the mud got, the more difficult it became to travel across the space. We've also got the animals which lived in Eastern Chiapas, the snakes, the crocodiles. Most notably, you've got the diseases. You've got malaria. You've got poisonous plants which could kill you. You've got flash flooding, which made it very difficult to cross paths. Often they had to use fallen trees. And a lot of people did die in the jungle. Most notably, we've got the case of Carlos Frey, who was an assistant on the 1943 expedition of Franz and Trudy. He later went on to be one of the discoverers of Bonampak. He returned in 1949 on the Mexican expedition to the site, and he drowned. But there was a little bit of mystery around this death. People also thought that it was possible that he was murdered by the Lacandon. So, as well as being a physically threatening space, Eastern Chiapas was also a morally threatening place. So, at this time period, you had this notion of a dangerous tropicality, not only in Mexico, but across the tropics. There seemed to be a degenerative effect of the rainforest on people's minds and on their souls. So, most notably, you've got the Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, which speaks to this corruptive effect of the jungle, how it would turn people into, thieves and murderers. It would bring out their dark side. Alcoholism was a big problem. In the jungle, a lot of people would turn to alcohol because of the difficulties of living there, far from civilization. You've got here from the Diary of Franz an illustration of what was called shotgun rock gut. So to reduce the fights between the chicleros, alcohol would be banned, and actually they would ration sugar, because using the sugar, this very strong alcohol could be manufactured, and it was called shotgun rock gut because it would literally rot your guts. It was so strong. And here we have the recipe of how to make shotgun rock gut from the Diary of Franz. Another reason why this region was seen as threatening and dangerous was because it was a border region between Guatemala, and this frontier was not well defined. And there was fears right up until the 1930s that Guatemala would invade Mexico, especially under Ubico, the president of Guatemala, who was a strongman who often threatened to invade. And it was feared that a chiclero or a logger from either country could, they would often cross over, Guatemalans would cross over into Mexico, take Mexican chicle and vice versa, and it was feared that this could be the powder keg which could set this conflict alight. So, the imaginary of Eastern Chiapas began to change through the influence of people like Franz and Trudy, who challenged this imaginary of Eastern Chiapas as a threatening space. We can see it in their diaries. Here we have displayed one of Trudy's diaries and two of Franz. And here you can see feathers and we've got illustrations that Franz made of the different plants. So in their writings, they talked about the majesty of the forest, the wonders, the diversity of the animals and the plants there. And they weren't alone, but they were prolific writers. So through their writings in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, we start to see a change, a challenge to this imaginary. Of course, as I've mentioned several times now, the Lacandon were amalgamated with the territory. So at the same time that the jungle was reimagined, so were the Lacandon. So despite the writings which I showed you in the previous section, speaking about the Lacandon as being primitive savages, we see in the writings of Franz and Trudy and others this idealization of the Lacandon as guardians of the rainforest. So you've got a critique not only of civilization, but also of this idea of the Lacandon as being uncivilized. Franz and Trudy talk about how they were more civilized than supposedly civilized people, because they didn't steal, they didn't rob, they were polite. And at this time period, the Lacandon were always depicted closely against trees, and to this day still have this romanticized depiction of the Lacandon. So this transition really gathered pace in the 1960s. This is no coincidence, right? You've got the beginnings of a worldwide ecological movement, but also at this time, the amount of deforestation in Eastern Chiapas meant the jungle was no longer so threatening anymore. You know, it can be seen as threatening when it was so greatly reduced. And so, thanks to, in part, the lobbying of Trudy, in 1972, you had the creation of the Lacandon community and the first reserves in eastern Chiapas. And you have it was the biggest land grant in Mexican history, 600,000 hectares of land, the title given over to the Lacandon people. So in theory, you know, this sounded like a good thing, right? But the Mexican government continued to view Eastern Chiapas as a place for exploitation. 2 years after this land grant, they published a report, the grand vision of the Lacandon jungle. Here are 3 maps from the report showing their different ideas of how the jungle could be exploited. So we have industrial and artisanal potential, hydroelectric potential, and touristic potential. And they created Cofalasa, which was a semi-state-run logging company, which they had the Lacandon sign over the rights to the jungle, and there was a limit of 10,000 trees to be extracted per year. So in effect, this extraction continued as before. So despite a transformation in the imagined territory of Eastern Chiapas, the rhetoric is still quite different from the reality on the ground. Also in this time period, we see a transition from the naming of Eastern Chiapas, mainly through the writing of Franz and Trudy. They kept on referring to Eastern Chiapas as the Lacandon jungle, whereas previously it had been known as the Zendales jungle, right? They did this in part to push, to support the Lacandon and push for the Eastern Chiapas to be under the ownership of the Lacandon. And interestingly, we have in this map 2 communities shown from Terra Corazal and Nueva Palestina, so reflecting the reducciones, the reductions of the Spanish hundreds of years earlier. The only other settlers in Eastern Chiapas who were granted land rights were several thousand Chol and Celtal inhabitants. They were only given land rights under the condition that they moved and concentrated into these 2 settlements. Okay. Section 11 is called Invisible Indigenous Imaginaries, and it's the final section in the exhibition. Now, it's called this because so far, all I've shown you are maps made by outsiders. So far, I haven't shown you any map made by an indigenous person. Now, the people who made the maps had certain things that they wanted to extract from Eastern Chiapas. They had different valuations of the territory. The government saw the territory as profitable for extraction of natural resources. You've got environmentalists valuing it for its biodiversity, tourists valuing it for adventure. But what about the people who, for Eastern Chiapas, it's their home? This is the flip side of Eastern Chiapas that's kind of been invisible so far. So, this is where we want to hit home. You know, maps are subjective, and you can see this most clearly in this map showing unexplored zones of Eastern Chiapas. All this green area is unexplored. But this begs the question, unexplored by who? It wasn't unexplored for the Lacandon who lived there, right? So, really, we haven't shown Eastern Chiapas as a lived space. So Eastern Chiapas has always been a lived space. And we can see this most clearly with new mapping techniques, which are showing just how populated Eastern Chiapas was in the past. So map makers today are using what's known as LiDAR. So that's lasers sent out from helicopters or planes which scan the jungle to find archaeological remains below. And this new technique has revolutionized understandings of Eastern Chiapas. Now it's understood that perhaps 10 to 15 million people inhabited Petén in Guatemala and Yucatan and La Selva Lacandona, Eastern Chiapas. So how we understand Eastern Chiapas today as a rainforest wasn't really the case for most of its history. So from 1950 to 2000, the population of Eastern Chiapas increased dramatically from around 1,000 people to 200,000. This was mainly through agrarian reform carried out by the government, which encouraged settlement from the overcrowded highlands, which you can see in this map of population density from 1940, to the sparsely populated regions of Eastern Chiapas. Now, in the literature, this is often referred to, this process, as the colonization of Eastern Chiapas. It's referred to as land invasions, right? But this is only from one perspective. From an indigenous perspective, perhaps we can see it in a different light. Here we have a comparison of two different maps. This map showing the archaeological sites in Eastern Chiapas, and this showing the colonies, of the so-called colonizers of Eastern Chiapas. You see that it reflects previous population patterns. Is it an invasion, or is it simply a return? So here in this section we have two different maps showing the archaeological site of Yash Chilan. Yet again, I want people to think about the flip side of the situation and think about the importance of names and who gets to decide how we name a place. Yash Chilan is often referred to as a ruin. This is how it's labelled on the maps of France. However, it wasn't a ruin for the Lacandon inhabitants of Eastern Chiapas. It was a sacred site, a site of pilgrimage. And here in this map you can see how close the Caribales, that is the Lacandon familial settlements, how close they were to the different archaeological sites. So names are always political. As I've mentioned, the Lacandon jungle was a political act of Franz and Trudy. And, some of these other names, in the past in 1900, when Eastern Chiapas was known as El Desierto de la Soledad, it was never a desert or a wilderness to the Lacandon, it was their home, so it's always coming from someone's perspective. Again, looking at the flip side, here we have a map of the deforestation of Eastern Chiapas. Trudy was a fierce critic of the deforestation of the jungle. But another way of thinking about it is creation of new life. For the highlands indigenous migrants who moved into Eastern Chiapas, okay, it was deforestation, but it was also their subsistence. It was their way of surviving in face of adversity. So a message which I want to communicate through this exhibition is that we need to make space for indigenous imaginaries. And you can see this clearly in this juxtaposition of two different maps. On the right-hand side, we have a map showing the 1696 expedition of the Spanish into Eastern Chiapas to conquer the capital of the Lacandon, Chol, Sacbalan. And hundreds of years later, we've got a replication of this same struggle between state forces and indigenous people. So despite the hegemonic imaginary of Eastern Chiapas throughout the last 500 years being one of a hostile, dangerous, threatening space, a space of resistance, on the flip side, we have an indigenous imagined territory that hasn't really been shown. This is a space of indigenous autonomy, of refuge, of a challenge to state forces. And here you can see a map made in 1994, Zapatista resistance to the government. So we have the same contested imaginaries emerging 400 years later. Now, in conclusion to the whole exhibition, I want to press home that the map is not the territory, but the map affects the territory. So when map makers have shown Eastern Chiapas to be unexplored, this encouraged further exploration, right? When Franz highlighted different resources on maps, this encouraged people to carry out further exploitation. But what would happen if we create more inclusive maps? If we imagined Eastern Chiapas from an indigenous perspective, and finally we're starting to see self-representation of Eastern Chiapas from, for example, the Lacandon's own eyes. So the final juxtaposition of maps that I want to show, we have maps from Franz's diaries showing different Lacandon houses, Lacandon Caribales. I wanted to put them in conversation with this map made in 2016 by Lacandon children. And here you can see Lacandon children are representing their own homes, their own community of Naha through their own eyes. And finally, the interactive element of the exhibition is for people, after going through these different 11 sections, to write a name, to write a word which represents to them the space of Eastern Chiapas. Another critical element of the exhibition are a running series of events, of workshops, of films. So here we have a map, a green map made of San Cristóbal, made with the assistance of an NGO called Green Map, based in New York. So throughout the exhibition, we programmed certain events to more critically engage the population of San Cristóbal in this critical cartographic thinking. So apart from the environmental, the green map of San Cristóbal, we have a musical map, and we're going to make a rainbow map showing safe and dangerous spaces for the LGBT community in San Cristóbal. So thank you.